A lecture will be delivered by Mr. Niranjan Rajadhyaksha, and Dr. Jessica Seddon would be chairing this session. We also have the honor of Dr. Vijay Kelkar attending and participating in the session today. So to begin with, may I invite on stage Dr. Vijay Kelkar, Mr. Niranjan Rajadhyaksha, and Dr. Jessica Seddon, please. And as I mentioned it almost in every program, including this one, there are no penalties for clapping. So when you feel like, do clap and that's fine. I have the honor of introducing you to people on the stage. Many of you would know of them already. But for the benefit of students, sir, allow me one disobedience, Dr. Kelkar, and that's introducing you. I know that you would not like much of this, but for the benefit of the students, please allow. Dr. Vijay Kelkar is a Punekar, a graduate from College of Engineering, Pune, and a PhD from University of California at Berkeley. It's important because many of you are economics students, so I thought I'll read it out for you. Dr. Kelkar has served in almost every possible role that has shaped or that had opportunity to shape the economic policies in our country. I'll not be able to read many of those, but they include many advisory positions, whether finance ministry or prime minister's office, or the individual ministries like the commerce ministry. They include being chairperson of various committees, and you would have heard of many, many Kelkar committees. You would have studied some of those in your academics. Dr. Kelkar also has been Government of India Secretary in the Petroleum Department, as well as the Finance Secretary of Government of India. He retired as Chairman Finance Commission in the rank of a Union Cabinet Minister. And as many of you would know, in January 2011, the President of India awarded Dr. Vijay Kelkar Padma Vibhushan, the second highest civilian award, for distinguished and exceptional service to the nation. And what an honor it is for Pune International Center that Dr. Vijay Kelkar is a trustee and vice president of the center. We are thankful to Dr. Jessica Seddon, who has come over all the way from Chennai to chair the session today on our request. Dr. Jessica Seddon is the founder director of Okapi, an IIT Madras incubated research and consulting group. This group is focused on institutional design for complex goals in changing times. She's focusing on interfaces between technology change and social structures. Pretty unique. So let me read it again. She's focusing on interfaces between technology change and social structures and their implications for achieving broad development goals. Dr. Seddon has advised a number of state and national government initiatives in India. Most recently, the Prime Minister's National Transport Development Policy Committee and High-Powered Expert Committee on Urban Infrastructure. Dr. Seddon is also a fellow at IIT Madras Center for Technology and Policy. She's published many book chapters and articles on various topics, and the journals include Cambridge University Press, Stanford Social Innovation Review, Foreign Affairs, and HBR, the Harvard Business Review. Her work has been supported by Google.org, the Stanford University, University of California at San Diego, and ICICI Foundation in India. Dr. Seddon has held research positions as Assistant Professor Political Economy at University of California, San Diego, and in the Office of Chief Economist at World Bank. She has earned her PhD from Stanford University. And before that, before she traveled a few time zones in US, she did her graduation in Harvard University. So I guess that's Dr. Jessica Seddon for you, chairing the session today. Thank you. And the speaker of the session today is Shri Niranjan Rajadhyaksha. Many of you know him as executive editor of Mint, the financial daily. Many of us are big fans of his column in the newspaper titled Cafe Economics that has won many, many awards. And of course, some of us feel very, very good, feel great to have read his book on Rise of India, its journey from poverty to prosperity. This is published worldwide by John Wiley and Sons, if some of you haven't yet looked at it. Mr. Rajadhyaksha studied economics at Mumbai University. He also taught the subject for a few years. He is currently member of academic board of the Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics, where he also teaches public policy. He has previously been associated with the Takshashila Institute as a board member. Takshashila Institute is a think tank based in Bangalore. That's Mr. Niranjan Rajadhyaksha for you. Thank you. Before I request Dr. Kelkar for his opening remarks, I must just add another line. How often would we get the glitterati of public policy making like the one that we have today? And what an honor it is to have these people to share their views on public policy with the members of PIC and with young and bright students who have all gathered today. With that note, may I request Dr. Vijay Kelkar to please give his opening remarks and talk a bit about the lecture series. Sir.
Dr. Rajadhyaksha, Prashant, trustees of the PIC, our members and the students and friends. I just want to make introduction to this lecture series, why we started it, and what's the importance of today's session. The ambition of the PIC is to become a think tank, and one of the important roles of think tank is to help policy dialogue and policy debate and hopefully policy action. So we thought that one important way of improving policy is first to understand how this is made. Once we understand that how the policies are made, hopefully that will give us some kind of opportunity to intervene, to suggest how it can be improved. And that was the logic of the lecture series. It was inaugurated by Yashwant Sinha, who gave a first lecture on art and science and policy making. It was followed by Ambassador Devre, who spoke on area foreign policy. Then Shankar Acharya spoke on, essentially, on budget making and the policies made. But today is a very special lecture because we are going to get insights about policy science. Policy science is a very comparatively new discipline. And in India, of course, it's very, very little work has been done, unfortunately. And Niranjan is one of the few thinkers, in my view, who have thought about deeply and on this issue. So we're really fortunate that he agreed to speak on the science part of policy making. And Niranjan, I got introduced to this subject by a book which I would recommend to all the students to read. It was the best book I ever read in my life. It was written by his currently, I think, the Dean of Kennedy School of Government, George Allison, Professor Allison. The book is called The Essence of Decision. And there's the most fascinating insights that book provides about policy making in the United States. And I really recommend that book. So that's really attracted me to, I think we should do something similar in India. And I want to thank Jessica, who agreed to come and to chair it. She has worked really truly diverse fields of policy making. I mean, I got first introduced to her writings when I had some opportunity to work on federalism, and she has written extensively on Indian problems related to Indian federalism, especially fiscal federalism. And then, of course, I had again the opportunity to learn from her when I was working on public-private partnership, and she has done very pioneering work in some of colleagues from IIT like Ashwini Mahalingam and others on the areas of, and again I'll urge students to look at her writings because it's extremely important way of using really the cutting edge theory for our policy issues which we face. So thank you, Jessica, for agreeing to come to chair it. And I'm going to make a public announcement what you're committed privately, Niranjan, because after this lecture series, Niranjan is going to bring out a paper drawing upon the insights of all the individual lectures, his own lecture, which was the PIC's policy paper. As you know, PIC brings out policy paper. And this paper will be written by Niranjan, drawing upon his own analytical insights, and also the practitioners who spoke here. We are trying to persuade Dr. Manmohan Singh to speak in this series. I'm hoping that he will agree. As a compromise, we've agreed with him that he did not come to Pune. If he has, in case he has difficulties, he can give a lecture for video conferencing. So I'm hoping that it will work out. And also we are trying to get Mr. Sharad Pawar to speak in this series. So after that, Niranjan, then the ball will be your court to bring out the policy papers. So without, I know all of us are waiting to hear both Jessica and Niranjan. So I request Jessica to take over. Thank you very much.
Pune International Center for inviting me to chair this session. I'll just take 1 minute and then we can turn it over to Niranjan just to kind of complement the idea behind a series on the art and science of policymaking and to build a bit of a bridge between perhaps the underlying thoughts that the art is the messy political part, the reality, the science is the part that we wish were more true and perhaps could be built on evidence and logic and so on, and art and science is where these two things come together. But I think rather than seeing art and science as something where these two things come together and potentially clash, we also need to look at it as a bridge. So I'm just going to start off with a quote from John Maida, who's a sometimes design academic. He's also an investor. He's written a couple of books on leadership. But his point on artists and scientists, so the people who've been in this lecture series, are that both are dedicated to asking the big questions placed before us. What is true? Why does it matter? How can we move society forward? Both search deeply and often wanderingly for these answers. We know that the scientist laboratory and the artist students are two of the last places reserved for open-ended inquiry, for failure to be a welcome part of the process, for learning to occur by a continuous feedback loop between thinking and doing. So over to Niranjan to inject some of the thinking and some of the science into what I gather has been a series of very impressive lectures about the art. And then after Niranjan, I'll argue with Niranjan a bit, and we'll turn it over to questions from the audience and last word from Dr. Kelkar. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Kelkar and the Pune International Center for giving me the opportunity to speak in this very prestigious series on economic policy. Pune actually is a city which is very close to my heart, and I sometimes say that if I had the advantage of time travel, my first port of call would be Pune at the end of the 19th century. You know, the Pune of Tilak, Agarkar, Ranade, Mahatma Phule, Savitribai Phule, Gokhale. And what was special about these people was not that just they were great intellectuals, but they were also institution builders, you know, and perhaps Gokhale Institute is one example of that tradition of institution building. And I think I've said this to Dr. Kelkar in private, I think in one of our meetings in Mumbai, that it is my sincere hope that the Pune International Center will be the 21st century version of the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha in terms of its impact. The previous speakers, as Dr. Kelkar explained in this series, have been deeply involved in the policy process. They've actually been got their hands dirty in the policy process. I have not had that advantage. I've just been an observer. as a journalist and then later as part of some of my academic research. And I think there is an important difference between being a participant in something and observing something. And frankly, in my mind, there is no doubt that the participant is the more important person. You know, the observer is just standing at the side and watching what's happening. But nevertheless, the bystander does have some advantages which I hope I shall try to use today. The most important thing is that the bystander has a detached perspective on how policy evolves, you know, because he's standing aside. So one of my favorite books actually is the autobiography of Peter Drucker, the famous management writer, scientist. And it's very apt. Peter Drucker's autobiography is called The Adventures of a Bystander. And that's what I think I have also been. And Drucker explains the advantages of being a bystander. And he says that the bystander sees things neither the actor nor the audience notices. Above all, he sees differently from the way the actors or audiences see. Bystanders reflect, and the reflection is a prism rather than a mirror. So it also refracts. So I think it's a very interesting way of looking at the role of a bystander, and I hope to use that perspective to talk about the art and science of economic policy today. So let's start off with how did the thinking about economic policy evolve, you know, and as Dr. Kelkar again said, there's not much of a structured theory of economic policy in the sense that we see other areas of economics having very rigorous development in various areas. Economic policy is still not got a rigorous theory, but there's been an evolution which I would like to first explain, especially to students here. So economic policy, or the theory of economic policy, is a relatively new area in economics, and it came into its own only after the 1950s. And there are specific reasons why this happened. You know, while by then economics had a theory of prices, inflation, a theory of international trade, there's game theory, but the theory of economic policy actually took off only in the 1950s. So why was that? So I think it goes back to some of the old thinking in economics, and I think many of you here are students of economic theory. So in a way, we all begin with the classical economists, and while the classical economists did understand economic dynamics, how economies fluctuate, how they rise, how they stagnate, eventually, Adam Smith is the classic example that he conceived of a very minimalist state, what later people have called the night watchman state. That what would the government do? The government will maintain law and order, provide public goods, ensure that markets function. But there are very few tasks which this tradition of economics gave, So in that sense, there is not much scope for dynamic economic policy because there are very few tasks which are sort of cast in stone. But then things started changing, especially by the second or third decade of the 20th century. So the other thing which I should have mentioned is that the dominant view within mainstream economics was that even if markets move away from equilibrium, they eventually find their own way back into equilibrium. So there's nothing beyond a minimal role that the state can do to bring markets back into equilibrium. And that's another reason why economic policy per se does not fit into the general mainstream economic thinking. Now, what happens later? There's a lot of, first of all, experiences in the real world, as well as how economists thought about those real world problems, which gave rise to a more structured thinking about economic policy. And this is what I would sort of call the age of optimism in economic policy. One is that there was a recognition that markets do fail, and again, we know the standard examples, that externalities like pollution, climate change today is a classic case, right? That the markets cannot deal with this. Monopoly is another example of market failure. Later, of course, not in the 30s, but George Akerlof and the others came up with this entire theory of asymmetric information, which in a way could be called a market failure. So there was a recognition that markets fail, and therefore something has to be done about that. The second is that, again, in the 1930s, the world slipped into this Great Depression. And while the economic consensus, whether it's the classical economists or people like Marshall or Pigou, they all thought that markets would self-adjust, that they would come back into equilibrium. But we know that didn't happen. So economics eventually saw the Keynesian revolution. And the fundamental view there was that governments can intervene to smoothen out economic cycles. The economic cycles are inevitable, but you can be stuck in an underemployment equilibrium. So governments have to intervene to bring things back to normal. The third is that, again, in the 1930s, 40s, saw the rise of econometrics, right? So basically the use of statistical tools to assess economic policies. And a large part of this also was related to the Second World War, but from the 30s there were attempts to build national income estimates, of GDP. Economic data got collected, then there were, right from the Cowles Commission onwards, there was attempts to find statistical patterns, which essentially is what econometrics does. So there was a rise of econometrics, which allowed policymakers to assess the impact of their interventions in market economies. So these were some of the factors which brought the government more intensively into the economy, and therefore also led to the rise of some structured thinking about economic policy. But as I said, this was perhaps an age of innocent optimism. The view was that policymakers had some magic mantra, that you could smoothen out economic cycles, national plans would work, etc. So all optimism has to eventually be counteracted with perhaps an age of pessimism. So then it followed, where there was a reaction against this overt optimism about the efficacy of economic policy. And again, I would like to mention a couple of developments in academic economic thinking and in the real world. So the first was that, when you think about national economic policy, you assume that you know something about how all the individuals and all the components of an economy, what they want. And so again, in 51, Kenneth Arrow essentially placed a dynamite under this concept that there's something called a social welfare function which could be maximized. And perhaps it's a little technical at this point, but what Kenneth Arrow showed is that you cannot, adding the preferences of individuals does not necessarily give you an aggregate social choice which is internally consistent. So this, in a way, creates the first doubts about whether there are these, aggregate social preference functions which can be maximized or optimized. The second was the rise of what is called public choice theory. So in the age of optimism, the assumption was that public servants, be they government officials or bureaucrats, were disinterested people who were trying to do good for society. So what the public choice theorists showed in the 50s and 60s, Anthony Downs, James Buchanan and several others, that public officials behave just like you and me, that what they try to maximize is their own interest, and sometimes their own interests are linked to the interests of special interest groups. So therefore, there is no such thing as aggregate policy. There are lots of competing groups trying to maximize their own interest. So there is no such thing as dispassionate economic policy. That is what the public choice theorists. And then in the 70s, you had what is called the Lukács critique, which perhaps is the final nail into the age of optimism. So the Lukács critique again is a slightly technical thing, but a lot of students of economics here. So basically, it said that econometric models that seek to assess the impact of a new policy could actually not work. They lead to policy failures because people respond to policy. It's not that there's a policy and then nothing happens at the other end. People also change their behavior. So therefore, there are a lot of policy failures. So I think these three issues, Kenneth Arrow's work on aggregate social choice, the public choice insight that public policy is not dispassionate, that there is interest involved in it, and the Lukács critique that people anticipate and respond to policy, and therefore sometimes ensure that it fails, were three sort of important developments in economics that in a way corrected this earlier age of optimism. So as always, the truth lies somewhere in between, right? So it's economic policy. It's not true that economic policy is doomed to fail, right? We have seen that policy works. It doesn't always work. That's the whole issue. So designing policy is not as easy as people think it is, So now, what are the problems in economic policy, right? So we have economic theory, but it has to be tempered with political realities. Like market failures, there are government failures. Economic models have their own limitations, through which you try to empirically assess policy. There are information constraints, and there is strategic behavior in the sense that people respond to policy. If you studied game theory, you know that it's a theory of strategic behavior, right? That I anticipate what the other person is doing, and then I make my decision. So therefore, you see that in the world of policy as well. So this is one phrase which has always stayed with me. Thinkful wishing. We normally use the phrase wishful thinking, but I would say policy thinking or policy is thinkful wishing, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So there was this very famous development economist who later sort of ventured out into a whole range of areas called Albert Hirschman. And Albert Hirschman, I read it in one of his essays on the integration of Europe after World War II. So what happened after World War II? If you read the history of Europe, essentially from 1875 to 1945, Europe has a series of wars. There's been periods of peace, but extremely volatile period in European history. And after the Second World War, there was this sort of group which saw that you should put an end to this. So they talked about European integration. And the European integration was not just a wish. They had thought about how to do it first, and I'll come back to that later in my lecture, how they did it. But I've always thought that this thinkful wishing is more important than wishful thinking, while discussing economic policy. And needless to say, in India, sometimes we see too much of wishful thinking and too little of thinkful wishing. Yeah. So let's try to assess some of the examples of this, what I would call thinkful wishing. But before that, something which is there in the Arthashastra of Kautilya. So in the Arthashastra, which is sometimes called a treatise on economics, it's more a treatise on governance and policy. Kautilya says that the primary task of a policy maker is to give advice to the ruler on how to pursue specific goals. Yeah, and there is a sort of part of the Arthashastra which basically says that ideas have to precede action, and mantra purva sarvarambha. So basically, you need, every government or every ruler needs a policy maker and a policy thinker, that you have to think through what you are trying to do. And again, this is the subject of my talk today, that how do you think through economic policy and the design of economic policy, and what are the things you have to be careful about. So again, if you go back to what Kautilya said, the primary task of a policy maker is to give advice to the ruler on how to pursue specific goals, right? Now, in the world of policy, there is a division of labor. The goals are set by the political system, and the policy makers have to evolve policies or policy frameworks which will allow the political system to meet those goals. So remember always that sometimes economists have a very pure view of the world, that in the world of policy or the economics of policy, you cannot wish away the politics of it, So this sort of division of labor between, so think of it this way, the government decides that we want to go from here to here, and it's the policy thinkers or the policy advisors who have to tell the government how to go about it, how to build the road from here to here. But it cannot decide the destination. And one recent example which I would share with you is the new monetary policy agreement which has been signed. So in February, before the budget or maybe after the budget, March, the government of India and the Reserve Bank of India have signed a monetary policy agreement. It's the first of its kind, and subsequently now there have been changes to the Reserve Bank of India Act to ensure that this monetary policy agreement sort of becomes part of law. And what is the basic design of the monetary policy agreement? It is that the government of India sets the inflation target. The inflation target is no longer set by the Reserve Bank of India. So now if it's 4% plus minus 2% is the inflation range that has been given to by the government or by the political system to the Reserve Bank of India. And after that, the Reserve Bank of India is supposed to be given operational freedom, that actually pursuing policy, what to do, how do you change interest rates, what do you do to the rupee, all this can follow. The Reserve Bank of India has the freedom to pursue its policies, but the goal is set by the political system. And I think this sort of division of labor is common in most economic policy, that the politics has to set the goal, and then the economists or the policy makers have to figure out how to go through that, go towards that. So the 1991 economic reforms, So I've always thought that this was a very, very good example of this marriage of economic thinking and political wisdom, right? The science and art of economic policy. So what happened that in 1991, as most people know, India was in a severe balance of payments crisis. That balance of payments crisis was built actually on a deeper fiscal crisis of the Indian state. And then in 91, India shifted. So it was not just a problem of international liquidity, that we could not meet our international obligations. Deeper down, it was a failure of the Indian development model, or at least rather than failure, you could say that it was no longer relevant, that model. It had needed to be changed. And again, if you think, 1991 economic reforms did not change the goal, right? Right from the early days of the Indian national movement, if you read Justice Ranade, if you read Subhash Chandra Bose, Savarkar, anybody, the goal was always to create an industrially advanced India, which would also have, because of its industrial power, would have strategic autonomy in a complicated world. So that never changed in 91. All that changed was the how to go about that issue. So again, but it was not a series of ad hoc measures. There was a very, very clearly thought out, I wouldn't say plan is not the right word, but it was a clear sort of road towards dealing with this problem. So every individual policy change fitted into this bigger, comprehensive and consistent policy program. So just look at some of the things, So we all know these. Industrial licensing was scrapped so that to give greater freedom to entrepreneurs, that it would be private capital which would do most of the investment, not the public sector. Then there were trade reforms, tariff rates came down, which helped India integrate into a growing world economy. Tax policy again was designed for efficiency, not just to collect revenue for the government. The exchange rate, which used to be fixed by the Reserve Bank of India, was floated and was determined by, at least to some extent, by the markets. Financial sector reforms were introduced. in a bid to ensure that capital is allocated more efficiently. Then the, fiscal deficits used to be a large part of the deficit should be funded by printing new money by the Reserve Bank of India. That came to an end in 97. The government eventually agreed to stop what is called ad hoc treasury bills, and then the FRBM, which Dr. Kelkar was involved with, said that the Reserve Bank of India cannot subscribe to government securities in the primary market. So in a way, funding government deficits through the printing press and therefore creating inflation, that was stopped. So, so all of these things again was what I would call wishful thinking rather than, thinkful wishing rather than wishful thinking, because it was, everything fitted into each other. And there was actually, here was a classic example of very clear thinking and clarity on how to change policy. Okay, you have some more here. Okay. So 1991 is another way of looking at how there was, clear thinking. So if you look, India opened its tradables market faster than its non-tradables. So tradables would be production of goods, basically, which move across borders. Non-tradables would be services like banking, insurance, a lot of these. So I think the tradable sector was opened up first, non-tradables later. The goods market was liberalized first. The factor markets are still not fully liberalized. Factor markets means markets for land, labor, and capital. And as you know, that these battles continue to be fought about labor reform and land reform. If you look at the external sector, the current account was made convertible early on, but India was always very careful about capital capital account opening. Monetary. So again, just like I mentioned, what industrial policy did, etc. If you look at it this way also, you see that there's a certain pattern to India's economic reforms over the past 25 years. And this could not have happened without very good policy thinkers, both in the finance ministry and other parts of government. And as we know that there is, the politics of economic reforms in India can be very fragile because of political realities and interest groups. So Montek Singh Ahluwalia, actually very perceptive wit, he said that India has strong consensus on weak reforms, and I think this issue of weak reforms is we never had big bang reforms, but I think we had a very well designed reforms program. So let's call it the New Delhi consensus, right? We've heard of the Washington consensus, etc. Now just compare. We always look back and say 25 years, we could have done more. Why is there no big bang reform? But you look at whatever has been achieved. India has been growing quite rapidly. But look at the other models of this era. So first there was this thing called shock therapy, that when communism collapsed, many economists, especially Jeffrey Sachs, they suggested that former communist countries should move to market economies at one stroke, just give them a shock therapy. That proved to be disastrous. Then there is this entire model of Latin American socialism. So there was Brazil and there was Bolivia. So we know both these countries today are on the verge of, Bolivia especially, on the verge of economic collapse. The Washington consensus, again, very powerful, kept questioning India about the pace of its reforms. But since the 2008 financial crisis, many parts of the Washington consensus also have been questioned. So if you look at the world, we tend to sit here and question. And obviously there have been failures. I'm not saying that 1991 reforms did not have failures of the reform path. But actually, whatever has been done has been, quite successful, and it has stayed the course, unlike a lot of other economic models. And I think China is perhaps the only example which could match India in terms of a reforms or economic policy framework which has survived. Okay, now I want to just shift to this issue of art of economics, right? Now, this is not a phrase which is heard very often. All economic students at some point are introduced to this binary of positive economics and normative economics, right? We've all, Milton Friedman wrote a very famous essay in 1955 about positive economics and normative economics. So positive economics is in a way the science. What is, it is to explain the reality. Normative economics is what should be, that what is, not just what is, but what should be. So this is, Friedman was very clearly in defense of positive economics. And what he said is that the way to judge an economic theory is not by asking whether its assumptions are realistic, but whether the theory can be used to make good policy predictions. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that this positive economics thinking, you may agree or disagree with Friedman, but it brings into our discussion the importance of the science of economics, science based on large policy models, and they're central to the business of policy making. So you cannot ignore the science. But it is my view that the science of positive economics has to work in tandem with what is called the art of economics. And what is this art of economics? So Friedman famously discussed positive economics, normative economics. It's there in our economics textbooks. We've all repeated it in our answer sheets, etc. But Friedman actually glossed over a third category, because he borrowed these two terms from something earlier, and that something earlier had a third category which Friedman glossed over. And that is the art of economics. So John Neville Keynes, who perhaps today would be better known as father of John Maynard Keynes. So Keynes had mentioned this thing called the art of economics. And just as I said, positive economics is what is, normative economics is what should be. The art of economics examines the best way to reach a particular goal. So again, if we go back, I kept saying that policy thinking is about how do you reach that goal. That goal is given to us by the political system. And this is where the art of economics comes. So that famous essay of Keynes, now forgotten sometime in the 1880s, few practical problems admit of complete solution on economic grounds alone. Account must also be taken of ethical, social and political considerations that lie outside the sphere of political economy regarded as a science. Now this is a very powerful statement. So basically what again Keynes is saying is that you may be, if you think about it in today's terms, that you may have the best economic science, you may have the best policy models, but you have to also consider political realities, institutional realities, ethical realities to design policy or to think about policy. And it's another very, quote I came across a few years ago, and I really liked it. This is a former finance minister of Chile. I assume he would be Alejandro Foxley, right? I don't know, perhaps I know. Economists must not only know their economic models, but also understand politics, interests, conflicts, passions, the essence of collective life. For a brief period of time, you could make changes by decree, but to let them persist, you have to build coalitions and bring people around. You have to be a politician. So again, in a way, this widens the scope of policy from just economic models or theories to the broader role of collective life. So again, as I said, effective policy thus has to combine the science of economics and the art of economics, and they have to work in tandem. But what does this mean in practice? So in the rest of the lecture, I'm just focusing on 6 specific dimensions or dilemmas of policy, and how people have to balance the art and science of policy making. So I just call them the 6 sutras of economic policy. So the first sutra, the first principle, that everything is interconnected. Now what does this mean? That you have to basically think of the economy as a whole, a good policy maker. See, because different parts of the economy are interconnected. and a change in one part of the economy will, so if you're a policy maker, you tweak something here, something else changes. So basically, if you want to use the language of economics, then a policy maker has to think in general equilibrium terms, not in partial equilibrium terms. So he has to think about the economy as an entire unit rather than one sector, because what he does in one sector will have effects on the rest of the thing. Now, see, we see this very often, so think of steel. Steel manufacturers say that, we need to increase the tariffs on steel so that cheaper Chinese steel does not come in. The moment you do that, the auto manufacturers say that, listen, our costs are going up because steel prices are going up. Think about interest rates. People who have borrowed money want lower interest rates. People like my mother who are retired and have put money in the bank, they want higher interest rates. So for any policy, there is the balancing of interests. And this is part of the political process. What a policy economist has to do is to chart out the broader consequences of policy. So he has to give the general equilibrium view of the world. Now, obviously, general equilibrium, again, students of economics would know that it's a theoretical construct, right? We are told that there is somebody called an auctioneer, a Walrasian auctioneer, who has precise information to quote prices which will clear all markets simultaneously. Now, we all know that there is no such thing as, in the real world, general equilibrium. We know that there are some markets which are called missing markets. So general equilibrium is a very fine tool to understand economics. I'm not saying it's in its pure scientific form, it has to be necessarily used in policy. My suggestion is slightly different. That what general equilibrium makes you think is that how do various parts of the economy interact with each other. So at any point of time, if you do something in one part of the economy, what does it mean for the economy as a whole? What are the intended and unintended consequences of? And again, why is this so? See, if you generally, economic thinking is about general equilibrium, but political thinking or political action is usually partial equilibrium. Politicians represent certain specific interests. There will be somebody coming from a rural constituency who has a very different set of voter concerns, and I'm not running this down because that's the nature of a democratic system. They're supposed to represent these interests, but there is this balancing, and policy decisions have to be taken against the backdrop of these special interest group pressures. Now, sometime in the 80s, I remember Pranab Bardhan had published this series of lectures, political economy of development in India, where he said that three large interest groups, which is the business class, the urban professional class, and the large farmers, they have now become so powerful, they've got a stranglehold on economic policy, and all economic policy is there to protect their privileges. So therefore, which is why India is in this trap. Of course, things did change after that, so I'm not necessarily saying that interest group coalitions do not fall apart, but interest group coalitions do exist, and you cannot think of policy without understanding those interest group coalitions at work. But again, as I said, it is the role of the economist to look beyond these sectional interests to at least convince the government about the larger economy. So balancing these conflicting demands is not always easy. It requires astute political management. Economists have a role to play in explaining the broader general equilibrium consequences of any policy action. Now, this again is where I think it's very important to have clear policy goals, right? And these goals should ideally be macroeconomic goals. So, you can higher growth, low inflation, macroeconomic stability, because these actually are goals which rise above any sectional interest. So low inflation would help everybody, macroeconomic stability would help everybody. So pushing for these very, very clear macroeconomic goals is one very important part of the job of a policy economist. So you've got the goals. Now what do? How do you reach those goals? So, in policy economics, you have goals or targets and you have instruments. The question is, how do you match them? So the second sutra is about the choice of policy instruments to pursue these policy goals. So which policy levers have to be operated to reach specific policy goals? So there is a very famous, actually, perhaps the most famous rule in policy economics. Jan Tinbergen has sort of put it down. The Tinbergen rule says that for each policy target, there should be at least one policy instrument. So please, just I think pay attention, focus on this. I think it's very clear. He's trying to match policy targets and policy instruments, and he's saying that for each target, there should be at least one policy instrument. So if a policy program has more targets and instruments, then at least one target cannot be attained. So if you have, say, 4 targets and 3 instruments, then you cannot attain one of those 4 targets. On the other hand, if there are, say, 4 targets and 5 instruments, it basically means there is more than one way in which you can attain these targets. So this combination of instruments and targets is, I think, one of the most fascinating examples of economic policy at work, and I'll give you an example later. But before that, Gokhale Institute, so I suppose most people have done mathematical training, that in a system of equations you have overdetermined equations and underdetermined set of equations, right? Depending on the variables in an equation and the number of equations. So it's something similar, that a policy system can be overdetermined or underdetermined, and the Tinbergen rule actually gives you a very good way of thinking about it. So let me give you the example of central banking. Now, if you think about central banking, now the most important task for central bank is inflation control, right? Before the financial crisis, the view was that a central bank should only target the inflation rate. So it has a single policy goal and a single instrument, which is the short-term interest rate. It's a very, very simple use of the Tinbergen rule. One target, one instrument. But that's not the only way you can do it. The Reserve Bank of India, right through till recently, had multiple targets. So they said, we will target inflation, but we will also look at economic growth. We will also look at the exchange rate of the rupee. We'll also look at financial stability. So you have 4 targets, then you have to have at least 4 instruments to deal with them. And this is a separate discussion altogether. The Reserve Bank of India, in a way, sometimes messed this up because it didn't have enough instruments to deal with its multiplicity of targets. But again, the point I'm trying to make is that you've got a policy goal. Now, the second part of an economic thinker's or policy thinker's job is to figure out whether there are enough policy levers or policy instruments at hand to pursue these policy goals. Otherwise, you will have what is called an underdetermined system of policy. The third sutra, or the third big principle, I would say, is the need for policy credibility. So policy has to be credible, right? We've discussed again the fact that in the age of optimism of policy, people did not, or economists did not think about how ordinary people would react to policy. Yeah? So the credibility comes actually in this context. See, politicians always have strong incentives to keep changing policies or reneging on previous commitments. Right? That's the bargaining nature of political process. If anybody of a certain age, I think all young students here, but in the 80s, if you looked at government budgets, every year the taxes used to be changed, little here, little there. There was no particular reason for it. It was basically special interest groups, and one famous example in the polyester industry, when there was a war between Reliance and Bombay Dyeing, the changing indirect taxes, import duties was the way in which government sort of kept mixing up policies. So you need actually, for a stable and growing economy, you need policy stability, because companies think over the long term. Suppose I set up a factory and I've been told I'll be given a tax break. I invest 1,000 crores and then I set up the factory and the government says, no, I'm sorry, I've changed the rule. We've had this issue of retrospective taxation, which perhaps is the worst example of this. So policy credibility, policy stability are very important. So again, there is this concept of time inconsistency in economics, again, come up in the 1970s. So time inconsistency is, the tendency of policymakers to promise one policy in advance, but then choose another policy later. So you basically shift the goals, and this can have significant negative impact on the economy. So let's say, simplest example of time inconsistency is, say, a parent tells the child that if you don't do your homework in the night, you won't get dinner. That's the policy. And next 2 or 3 nights, the child does not do the homework but still gets dinner. I'm not saying you should not give dinner, but perhaps it's too harsh a example. I wish I tried it at home. But the point is that after some time, children stop believing what their parents are, saying. So in that sense, the credibility of the parental policy is this thing. So how do you deal with this issue of time inconsistency? So again, in economics, there's this balance between discretion and rules. So the economy keeps changing. So there has to be some discretion in the way you manage the economy, right? It can't be. An economy cannot be run by a mathematical formula. So there are times when certain unexpected things happen, policy has to change. But generally, you also need a sort of a bedrock of rules in an economy, policy rules. So again, let's go back to the inflation target. Now, we know for sure that 4% is the inflation target of the Reserve Bank of India, right? So it is something which the policy, the political system or the policy establishment has committed to. And if it doesn't meet it, it loses its credibility. The other is the FRBM, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, which is now a fresh look is being taken at it. So what does the FRBM do? The FRBM basically said that the government has to keep its fiscal deficit to below 3% of GDP and its revenue deficit should be 0. So again, this is a policy rule, right? So of course the FRBM was ditched later, but these are examples of why do we have policy rules? We have policy rules to deal with the time inconsistency problem and to deal with the policy credibility problem. So this is the third sutra, that while we have discretionary policies, for credibility you need rules. Then the fourth, this is like classic, what a doctor would say, right? You should always attack the problem rather than the symptoms. That there's a certain problem you want to deal with. Try to understand what the underlying symptom is and try to deal at the base of the problem. So the trick is to get a diagnostics right. So policymakers should identify just a handful of binding constraints or distortions that are the most significant obstacles. So essentially it means that you have to drill down to the core problem, right? Don't try to, you have 100 symptoms, don't fly around trying to deal with 100 symptoms. Try to understand what the underlying issue is. And sometimes there are very, very, clearly identifiable a handful of issues. Like if you look at the thinking in the first, decades after development, after independence, what is one of the binding constraints? Again, we've all studied it in class that India is an economy with low savings, right? So you have a massive savings constraint, but you need to push investment. So how do you deal with it? So it's a very clear diagnostic approach to the problem. Now you may agree with the planning framework or not, but I think in terms of thinking about what needs to be done. So, this thing of trying to go to the root of the problem, understand the binding constraint or where the market distortions lie is, again, it's an art as well as a science. So the classic paper, and I would thank my guru here for first pointing it out to me, Jagdish Bhagwati and V.K. Ramaswamy's paper in 1963 on domestic distortions, tariffs and theory of optimum subsidy. Now, this is actually a policy, a paper on trade policy, and what they were trying to do is they were trying to understand the conditions under which free trade is or is not the best course of action for a small open economy which has market distortions. Now, this is a mouthful of jargon, so let's just say that it was a paper basically in trade theory, in the theory of international trade. But what Bhagwati and Ramaswamy, their great innovation in this paper, is that they have given us what is called the targeting principle. And what they say is the optimal policy intervention is to target a market failure directly rather than indirectly. So, suppose there's a positive externality, then they say that give a subsidy there. If it's a negative externality, you should tax it. If you have external distortions which are affecting your trade, then you should use trade policy for it. If you have domestic distortions, then deal it with domestic policy. So basically, let's cut through all the jargon. What Bhagwati and Ramaswamy showed in this, I think one of the finest papers by Indian economists, is that you have to identify the market failure and treat it directly. So again, don't look at the symptoms, look at the core. So I think, there's this standard textbook of international trade by Krugman and Opsfeld, and they put it very well. It is always preferable to deal with the market failure as directly as possible, because indirect policy responses lead to unintended distortions of incentives elsewhere in the economy. So just take this as directly deal with the underlying issue, whether it's a market distortion or a binding constraint, and not with the symptom which you see. The fifth principle or sutra is that people are not lifeless bricks. Now, very often, we see in economic models that you assume that to a policy change or to, people just, they respond pretty passively. But one of my favorite development economists, P.T. Bauer, he obviously at that point of time, his book itself was called Dissent on Development. He questioned the development consensus of the 50s and 60s. And one of his essays, he criticizes those who saw the poor as lifeless bricks to be moved around by some master builder, that these grand policies and plans, as if the poor have nothing but to behave like bricks, just stay there and people will move them around to build edifices. So he questioned that. He said that people are thinking and feeling individuals, So a policy maker today has to look at participants in a modern market economy as real human beings, Treating them as variables in an equation is a fundamental flaw when it comes to policy making. So you have something, you have a problem, and you introduce a policy. Now you assume that the people will just accept that policy. It's not so. People anticipate that policy, or after that policy, they change their behavior. So therefore, there is a dynamic, response of people to policy change. And again, one very classic example is what is called Ricardian equivalence. So the simplest and the most popular explanation of Ricardian equivalence is that a government decides to run large deficits. And to run these large deficits, they borrow, right? And the assumption is that this will lead to a surge in economic activity and growth will take off. But what this Ricardian equivalence asks is that it may not necessarily be so, because if people are rational and forward-looking, then they will know that this debt which the government is taking on now has to be repaid at some point of time, right? Which means that there will be taxes to be paid in the future to repay the debt which is taken. So people will respond to a government stimulus by higher savings. Now, again, I'm not completely sold on this idea of Ricardian equivalence, but it's a good example of how to think about the fact that people can respond to the policy and respond in such ways that your policy fails. So again, just to repeat, government borrows in the hope that it will stimulate economic activity, but people say that this borrowing has to be repaid at some point of time. So I'll have to pay taxes in the future. So I may as well save this extra income, and the government policy fails. What the main takeaway from here is, again, people are not lifeless bricks. They respond. They think strategically. They think forward. Whether they think rationally is open for debate, and rationally in the economic sense of the word, but people respond to policy. And remember that policy makers, while we often say that people don't have enough information, even policy makers don't have enough information about how people will respond. It could be completely unanticipated. So even policy makers have to be aware of the fact that they are working under situation of inadequate information. And this is the sixth and the last sutra, or the last general principle, which is you have to change the context. Now I'll explain what I mean by that. Again, I'll take you back to what I had said about European integration, that Europe was, like, at least if not from 1870, or at least from 1914 to 1945, there was war, fascism, communism, whole-scale slaughter. And then, this group of very enlightened bureaucrats and politicians, and Jean Monnet, Dr. Padgavkar is here, so I'm quite sure he knows what I'm talking about. Jean Monnet and many other of these things, people said, how do you get this continent back into a stable situation? So Jean Monnet is, I read a lovely biography of him, and his dictum was change the context. What does he mean with it? That he means that people, nations take decisions, right? And these decisions have led to war, led to trade wars, led to actual military wars. So he says change the context, bring these nations under a system of interdependence, and then the same nations will take different decisions. So if you change the context under which organizations or people decide, then you get radically different results. And under what context do you normally take decisions? You take decisions under an institutional framework. Now again, in economics, institutions are understood differently from in political science, for example. You think of institutions like RBI or Gokhale Institute, right? In economics, these are organizations, these are not institutions. Douglas North, who won the prize a few years ago for institutional economics, it's a beautiful thing. He says institutions are rules of the game. So that is the economist's view of institutions. So basically, if you change the rules of the game, if you change the incentives of people, people behave differently. You don't have to change the people themselves. It's just the institutional change. And you can see that Europe was a classic case, right? That for 30, 40 years of slaughter, and then sudden international cooperation and, a common market, and now perhaps moving towards a political union, but now having a few bumps on the road. But so institutional reform, to change incentives, to change the context, are very, very important. And I think if you think of all reform programs, whether even if you talk about policy rules, if you talk about international commitments, these are all institutional changes. So once you into the WTO, you have committed yourself to a certain trade policy. If you have got an inflation target, you have committed yourself to a certain monetary target. Now these are all institutional changes which may not get the same amount of public attention that something like a FDI in retail will get. But these are actually more deeper reforms because they change the context under which people decide, people and organizations. And this is a quote from a Swiss philosopher who Jean Monnet thought very highly of. I'm not going to even try to pronounce his name. The experience of each person is a new beginning. Only institutions grow wiser. They store up collective experience, and from this experience and wisdom, men subject to the same laws will gradually find not their nature changed, but that their behavior does. So actually what really deep institutional reforms do is that the same people change their behavior, and they can change it in ways that benefit the economy. But to design these institutions is not at all an easy task, which is why institutional reform is perhaps the most important. But now this institutional change has to also be accompanied by change in narrative, And again, if you look at the recent developments in behavioral economics, it shows that the power of the narrative, that people are influenced by narratives. So is GST another tax, or is it GST a big move to unify India into one economic territory? Is the APMC reform something to do with some farming, some markets somewhere in rural Maharashtra, or is it about the freedom to farmers to sell directly to urban consumers? So how you build a narrative to connect it to the people, to connect it to the political system, is as important as this institutional change, changing the context. So even narratives are, I think, part of the context. So if I was to just encapsulate this, I would say three things in the sixth sutra: change the context, change the incentives, and change the narratives. So these are the 6 policy sutras which I briefly spoke to you about, which I think encapsulate the art and science of economic policy, both the scientific part and the political economy part, so to say. One is everything is interconnected, that you think in terms of general equilibriums. Second is you've got policy targets, but you have to understand which policy instruments, how many you have, and how do you design a policy target and instrument balance. Policy has to be credible, otherwise, if there's too much political instability at this time, inconsistency, it eventually backfires. Attack the problem, not the symptom. People are not lifeless bricks. We respond to policy and change the context. Thank you.
So you might have noticed some shuffling of paper up here. Prashant dissuaded me from following the dictatorial style of chairing and keeping everyone exactly at a time. So with everyone's permission, we started a bit late. We'll go a bit later in order to allow for questions and answers. So I told you I'd argue a bit with Niranjan, and so I'm going to argue a bit with him now and just put it out there for the question and answers, and then Dr. Kelkar will have the last word. So I think what Niranjan has done in these 6 policy sutras and in the discussion has given quite a concise, in fact, an amazingly concise tour of what I'm going to call Policy Science 1. So Policy Science 1 is what is the role of policy in the larger set of human impulses, of dynamics, of social dynamics, et cetera. And number 2, what are the instruments that some kind of unified representative policymaker should use, given that everybody who is not the policymaker reacts to them. And that's Policy Science 1, and I think he because it's the 25th anniversary of 1991, he slipped in a claim that 1991 was kind of the epitome of policy science, or was a good example of policy science, internally consistent and so on. Didn't get to develop it that much, so I won't argue with him too much on that point. But I think there's also a very important role for what I'm going to call Policy Science 2, which is the point that there is no representative policymaker. He's alluded to it in this lecture, Ken Arrow's result, this last point about changing the narrative, the importance of perspective, the importance of the story. But in some ways that was swept to the side as saying that's the art, the politics. But there is, in fact, a science of how to implement certain instruments. And it's a science that's very much in flux. It's evolving really fast. When I went to grad school, now what I spent my time doing, problem sets and slaving away, literally in the attic of the business school at Stanford, is regarded as the dark ages, and now there is new economic thinking. So I'll get into that in a second. But that there is a science of moving from what is the right instrument that a policymaker interacting with a sea of people and agents around them should take, to how do you think about policy in a world where the policymaker is itself an organization, may not even be an organization, maybe a culture, maybe a collection of organizations, maybe center, state, ULB, Panchayati Raj institutions, counselors, civil society, everybody kind of collectively bargaining that influences the instrument and its interaction with outside the state. And that, well, a lot of this is seen as the art of leadership, as something that's instinctive. It's something that good politicians kind of know and have a feel for, that's a creative process. It's very true. There's also a certain amount of, there's a canon, I mean, if you say the characteristics of science. So one of the Nobel laureates in physics, I had the honor of being at this gathering of like 30 Nobel laureates across all kinds of disciplines to talk about climate change. And in the dinner conversations, they were really interesting because there were people from physics and chemistry and so on. But one of them characterized a science as an internally consistent canon of findings that could be cross-referenced across papers that had some larger, that spoke to each other in a way that you could build on to advance the frontier. And that canon, that body of literature, was a way to distinguish and a way to check new contributions. So if your new contribution could be linked and was consistent and what came before it, it could be considered kind of an accretion, a new piece on that coral reef of science. If it completely disproved something core, that was a major breakthrough. But it was this guideline for a science. And to go back to this idea that there is a science too, that's a systematic look at how to manage the politics within the policymaker. I'm going to ask you a question. So imagine you have this situation. You want to pay a fact finder. You have to make a decision, and you want to pay a fact finder. So you say, okay, I have a pretty simple contract. I'll pay for decision-relevant information. So information that helps me come down on the side of option A or option B, right? Pretty simple, pretty reasonable. You pay for what's decision-relevant, outcome-based, in fact, not effort-based. I mean, not. You have two choices of how to do this. One is you can say, I want people who are going to be advocates for A or advocates for B. I'll send them out. I'll pay them for whatever information. They're allowed to hide what they find if it doesn't fit with their advocacy case. Option B is you get an ombudsman. You get someone who's neutral, who's a neutral arbiter. You say, I pay you for decision-relevant information, and you're not allowed to hide anything. If you hide anything, and I find out, and assume that you can find out, deal is off, you're put in jail, etc. Do you want the ombudsman, or do you want the advocates? Which is the optimal structure for finding the facts to make an evidence-based decision on option A or option B? Okay, who thinks that the advocates is the optimal structure under these circumstances? Who thinks that the ombudsman is the optimal structure? Oh, come on, that's more hands, but a lot of you are sitting on your hands. Okay, everybody has to raise their hand. Advocates? Okay, small. Ombudsman. Okay, so there's still, some of you are being chicken, but it seems like the majority is ombudsman. You probably guessed that that's wrong. It's actually advocates. And the rationale behind this is that it actually costs time and effort and money and everything else. It costs resources to find these facts. And so this advocate is thinking, or the ombudsman is thinking, well, I get paid for decision-relevant information. But what if I find 5 facts in support of A, 5 facts in support of B, and then they cancel each other out? I don't get paid for anything. But I've just found 10 facts, and I put in all that effort, and I can't hide anything. The advocates, so they have no incentive to take the effort to go search. Because remember, what I did say is there's no way you can control this person's fact-finding. You can't monitor that they've found every fact, because if you could, you wouldn't need them in the first place. The advocate, on the other hand, is going after these things with great zeal, tables them. You know you get all the A, all of the B, and then you make your decision. Now, that's a finding from a 1993 paper by 2 game theorists, de Watrapant and Tirole. It's an amazing paper. It's actually from the dark ages of policy science 2. So the dark ages of policy science 2 was dominated by essentially kind of old school game theory, where you treated people as utility functions, and you picked utility functions that were easy to deal with in closed form models. Simulations were kind of for those who couldn't hack the theory. And so we spent a lot of time when I was in grad school thinking about how to rationalize voting and then coming up with answers that depended on a particular distribution function. And these were widely published papers. So I think the point about this is not to go into the intellectual history part, but it's to say that this science has advanced an enormous amount, this science too. So I first got involved in India almost as a reaction to science too, because I was up in the attic in my mid-20s spending time thinking about functional forms that allowed for information to be inseparable from a utility function in bargaining over an arbitrarily large number of interactions. In other words, agreeing to disagree. But that was the style of science too, because we wanted to be really, really scientific in the sense of internal consistency. But it's evolved a lot. And as Niranjan pointed out, there's attention to behavioral economics. There's attention to psychology. There's attention to perspective, to narrative, to level of information. There's attention to the interplay of stories with economically rational behavior. And this has been incorporated into a set of systematic, strategically relevant pieces of probably what's called the kind of the new mix of behavioral and game theory, it has different labels now, but the point is that this no longer has to be done by instinct and art. This is stuff that's coming out in academic journals that are unfortunately well behind a paywall, usually filled with a fair amount of math that you have to sort of pull out, and are but they're quite useful. And one of the ways I got involved in India early on in the early 2000s when I was in grad school was that Stanford used to have this annual conference on Indian economic development. So I had the great fortune of meeting some of the people who were involved in the reforms of 1991 and kind of and when I came down from the attic and sort of sat in on this conference, sort of being adopted as kind of a pet, I guess. And I got a lot of chance to sort of talk to people about how they viewed strategy, go back to my papers and kind of how things were developed and think about what were the matches and the mismatches. And much of my recent work, in fact, I would say my entire career has come from looking at those matches and mismatches and then trying to bring them closer together. So as a side note for the students here, this area of science too, the science of how the multiple agents within policymaking interact with the multiple agents outside policymaking, these boundary spaces and how they work, is an incredibly exciting and relevant strategic area, the science too. Which leads me to the last point, which is the question of if 1991 marked the adoption of Science 1 into kind of policymaking and it's irreversible, did it mark the adoption of Science 2 into policymaking, into the instincts that any level of government, any committee, any branch of government has when it says, this is the lever that we will use to achieve goal XYZ? And I think the answer to that is damagingly, quite clearly, no. It's hard to think of an example of where there is an enormous amount of thought given to what happens after the decree, the level of involvement of the Supreme Court in decision-making, the nature of some of the agenda for urban reforms, without thinking about the imperatives of locally elected government. It could go on in a list, but I'll leave that as a challenge for you to think about in your papers. We can talk about it in Q&A. If we think about Science 2 as being extremely relevant for Generation 2 reforms, for regulatory design, for the interface between public and private, for dealing with a much more rambunctious federalism than we've had in the past, for all of these things. If we think about Science 2 as there, available, maybe behind a paywall, but certainly translatable, has that been adopted, and how can we promote further adoption? With that, I won't take up any more time and abuse my privilege as chair, but we'll turn it over for questions and answers, and then Dr. Kelkar can have the last word. So, questions? Oh, come on, it's not that hot out there. We're the ones under the lights. Questions? No questions.
Regarding Sutra number 5, which is the people are not lifeless bricks. in your narrative, I immediately in my mind started comparing India with China and the way China has managed their economy over the last 20, 30 years. Could you relate to this sutra with what they have done versus what we have done?
Let me be brutally honest. I don't know enough about the Chinese in this context to be able to answer that question. But so I can't offer you a ready Chinese example of this, but it's a fair question. But my general point is that, when so.
My question is about the social inclusiveness of the policy. I mean, we see that the design of the policy is such that it applies uniform across the spectrum of society. Even if it takes about it takes into account about the disadvantages in the society, they are basically about class. There are also some disadvantages which are based on gender or caste or something like that,
Yeah.
which don't have their origin in economics, perhaps. So, how should we approach policy making such that it takes into account these disadvantages which don't have their origin in economics?
Okay, you're absolutely right that in a country like India, there are still severe issues of caste discrimination, gender discrimination. If you have a strong economic growth, and in my view also urbanization, some of these issues do get tackled, but not all of them. In fact, arguments with the Marxists used to always say that the Marxists have there's an economic base and there's a superstructure, and they always thought caste was a superstructure problem. And Dr. Ambedkar would give the example of Mumbai textile mills, where supposedly in the Marxist thinking, the working class is together, and there were certain jobs which Dalits would not get. So I completely agree with you. So first of all, if you have one obvious thing is that if you have a economy which is rapidly growing, there's urbanization, some of these issues will be dealt with. Not all of them, So I think that on issues like caste, there is a case for sort of pointed or focused interventions. But we also have to remember that what is your ultimate goal? If your ultimate goal is to liberate people from the caste system, you should just ensure that whatever policy you design does not actually, in some perverse way, root them in the caste system. So, while again, I agree with you that there is that economics per se cannot. I would go with Dr. Ambedkar's sort of view on this, that economics per se cannot, or on its own cannot deal with issues like caste and gender. So there are scope for proper interventions which can correct these things. There have been gender, for example. There is this very famous study by Esther Duflo of the JPAL, the Poverty Action Lab at MIT. So where she has studied panchayats controlled by women, and there are control group of other panchayats which are not controlled by women, and she does show that in panchayats which are controlled by women, spending on issues like access to water, education, etc., is of a far higher degree than in panchayats ruled by men. So I think this is the point of institutional reform. That how do you change the context under which decisions are made?
This is about Sutra number 6. May I please request you to elaborate on the Swiss philosopher's quote, especially in reference to how it's not the nature that changes, but the behavior that changes.
The experience of each person is a new beginning, right? That people, people make the same mistakes or the same, sort of thing. But what actually the learning comes through institutions, on a social scale. That only institutions grow wiser because they store up the collective experience, right? So what he's saying is that human nature is not changed. It's the same people. So again, Jessica mentioned game theory, that in game theory, you can have two people in a strategic interaction, and if you change the rules of the game, you can have very different results. So it's the same people with the same utility functions or with the same goals, But if you change the rules of the game, their behavior changes. So that is what. So again, the reason I spoke about European integration, it's the same countries, but those countries, how do you bring them into an institutional framework which will avoid war? Yeah.
So I'm going to ask Dr. Kelkar to come up and do the closing remarks, but I have one observation, which is that 3 out of 3 questions were asked by men. And the sort of normal response might be for me to come up here and say, okay, we need a question from a woman. But I'm not going to do that because there is no obvious structural barrier to women asking questions in the room. But I'm going to say one thing from my own experience, which is that if you don't raise your hand, if you don't go pester the professor, if you don't just stand up and announce your place, it's not always going to be reserved for you. So next time, ask questions, please. Thanks. And with that, I'll leave it over to Dr. Kelkar.
Friends, let me first of all ask all of us to join hand, to give a hand to absolutely illuminating lecture by Niranjan and very extremely thoughtful remarks by Dr. Seddon. Only 2 comments I want to make. One is triggered by your beautiful phrase, which you said because of Hirschman, thinkful wishing. And I just want to give one example of this as a sort of illustrate the point. As you rightly said, that in policy making, the goals are set by political masters, a political level. And when I was working in the government, it was a wish of the political masters that India will formulate the fiscal responsible by policies. So they had a FRBM Act which was passed. And then I was asked, the then Finance Minister Jaswant Singh Ji, to prepare a roadmap. That was a political task. How do you go about it? And a group was set up, but I chaired it and all the mandarins were there of the Ministry of Finance. And it was looking backwards, this is a good example of all the wishful thinking. We could have gone in a very normal, routine manner to respond to this and give sort of projections. But I think there's a quite visual thinking, what you call creative thinking. And that is the time we brought out that one way of meeting these targets and still use this target, this system for enhancing growth would be to change the game by introducing goods and services tax. So GST came in that report as a proposal for the government for policy making. It was a silly example of what you call visual thinking. And hopefully it will happen this year. It took 13 years to happen, but it was perhaps an example of your visual thinking. And this, I want to mention that this one way in our country, we do have this instrument of committees or groups to create this kind of policy alternatives, because or wishful thinking collectively done, where the mandarins come together and bring out proposals for the government. But I want to add 2 more sutras. I was attracted by the sutras. I thought you may wish to consider 2 more sutras. There could be more, but that is 2 occurred to me when I was listening to you. And maybe they're implied, maybe they're not. One is, and this is a really expression I learned from Jessica. She says that quite rightly that India is ironically an information poor economy, which means that we have inadequate information decision making. That means there's a great deal of uncertainty. So in the principle of uncertainty, it leads to, I think, very massive occurrence of principle of unintended consequences. And a policymaker has to be mindful of principle of unintended consequences. In fact, as I'm publicly sort of holding people responsible for promises, I'm holding Professor Apte responsible for promise he has made. One of our policy papers will bring out in PIC is based on exploring the whole concept of unintended consequences. How, when policies are made, people didn't think about it, and how deleterious effects it had on the economy. One example is in Maharashtra, Jessica, we have a land reform they introduced called Kasel Taji Zameen, that means land to the tiller. And that turned out to be a disaster in terms of in Maharashtra's agriculture. That's one example. So one is principle of unintended consequences. And Sutra 9 is, for any better word, I'm going to say it and then what I call principle last mile. You may have very nice policies worked out on the government, but when it comes to the field level, where it's going to get implemented, how it works, and that has to be thinking backwards. Policymakers have to think about it, the principle of last mile. So that's another sutra. And the final Sutra 9. There's a one, you may remember, Jessica, in graduate school, we were looking at the paper, or Professor Apte may remember, it's a beautiful paper, I don't remember the author, it was the Quarterly Journal of Economics, called Economic Theory of O-Ring Theory of Development, which is a very important lesson for policy making. One of the space program, there was a disaster, space disaster. So the committee was set up to look at what happened. Analysis showed us finally there's a ring called shaped O that was faulty and that led to disaster. So in other words, it is really policies is details. Policy is not a grand designs alone, but it's also details. So that would be Sutra number 9, the O-ring theory of development, or I would translate for your sutra would be really the game is in details, not just grand theories of policy making. So, but having said this, I must compliment Niranjan for really absolutely outstanding lecture. And now we all wait for your forthcoming policy paper, which draws upon this. And incidentally, we'll be happy to know you have seen Yashwant Sinha's lecture, and he concluded many of them will resonate to what you said on his presentation. So did Shankaracharya. So a lot of things will resonate with your observations. So I think it's a task we all look forward to. And with this, I want again once more thank. I know it was difficult both for Niranjan and Jessica. They have spent a lot of time and efforts of doing this, and physically to come all the way from Chennai. I don't want to even tell you what morning flight she has taken to go back. Shows the sort of trouble she has taken. I'm really grateful to Jessica for coming here and sharing this session. And of course, once again, thanks to Niranjan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We'll just take another minute or two before we conclude the program. Of course, huge round of thanks for the speaker, the chairperson, and Dr. Kelkar. So if you could all put your hands together for all of them. Thank you. We have a tiny token of appreciation. If PIC could help and request Dr. Kelkar to first give it to the chairperson, Dr. Jessica Seddon. There is a book titled Tilak in Our Times. It was released very recently. And may I request Dr. Kelkar to present a copy of the book to Mr. Niranjan Rajadhyaksha. The book is edited by Dr. Mashalkar and Dr. Dilip Padgaonkar, both trustees of PIC. And many of you might have attended this program at the Tilak Vichar Manch. I must very quickly add a note of thanks to the members of Pune International Center who are here, those who are not necessarily the members, and most importantly, all of you students. All of these programs could happen thanks to a lot of cooperations from, before I let you go, I must mention that on tomorrow at 11 o'clock, we have another program where we are doing a book release on Siachen. The chief guest for the program would be Honorable Raksha Mantri, Shri Manohar Parikarji. So if you get onto your Twitters and Facebooks, so you would find a lot more details about the program. And you're most welcome to come and attend as long as you come and take your seats well in time. With that, and with a huge thanks to all the young and bright students who attended it, and it shows the interest in your lecture, Niranjan, that while I was observing, I wish I recorded it, not even a head turned. So that's how well they all were glued to the screens. So huge thanks to all of you, and look forward to see you again for another PIC program. Thank you.